What would you do if a deputy pointed a gun at your wife over a fake HOA complaint? I just wanted a quiet life on my own land, until a fake call sent deputies to our barn with guns drawn at my wife. From across the lake, the HOA watched her every move, never realizing they picked the wrong woman to push. Because once Sarah's past surfaced, everything flipped in an instant. The first thing you notice is the light. Not the sunset over the ridge, but the red and blue strobes hammering against our barn, washing the gray boards in police color. They spill across the dusty Wyoming Ranch Road, flicker over barbed wire and the dent in my old Ford, turning hanging dust into a pulsing fog. And in the middle of it all stands my wife, with a gun pointed at her face. Sarah is 10 yards from the barn doors, boots planted in dirt, back to the dark opening where 15 minutes ago she was coaching women through deadlifts and hill sprints. Her hands are up, fingers spread, shoulders square. Same faded green training shirt, same braid down her back. Everything is the same except for the deputy's pistol aimed straight between her eyes. "Ma'am, don't move," he barks. His voice tries to sound like command. His body says something else. One hand fists around the gun so tight his knuckles are white. The other hovers near the radio on his shoulder. His weight sits on his heels, shoulders locked. It's the way a man stands when he's scared. "Officer," Sarah says, calm and clear. "My hands are visible. I'm not moving toward anything. We can talk about this." 3 patrol cars idle crooked in the gravel, engines rumbling. Out past them, the lake catches the flashing lights and throws them back in broken streaks across the water. "Sir, stay where you are," another officer calls. He's by the front fence post, hand on his holster, eyes too wide for someone wearing a badge. The breeze carries the smell of hot engines and dry sagebrush, and underneath that, the familiar tang of manure from the goat pen behind the barn. I raise my hands slowly. Not because I think I'm a threat, but because I know what happens when fear and weapons share the same patch of dirt. "This is a mistake," I say, keeping my voice as level as I can. "There's no threat here. You've been sent on a bad call." The deputy doesn't look at me. His gaze stays locked on Sarah, like she's a bomb with a loose timer instead of the woman who hands out coffee and muffins after class. "Ma'am, step back. Hands higher," he orders. She does. 1 step, heel crunching on gravel, hands a little higher, fingers spread a little wider. If you filmed it, you could use it to teach compliance. Still, something in the set of her shoulders makes the hair on my arms stand up. Her weight isn't sagging, it's centered, ready. Sarah isn't preparing to attack him, she's preparing to control herself. My eyes flick past the cars, down toward the cattle guard at the end of the drive. That's when I see the white SUV. It's parked just off the county road, nose angled like it means to leave, but it hasn't moved an inch. A woman leans against the fender, arms folded over a crisp blouse, blonde hair shellacked into place. Bethany Crowell, president of the Lakeshore Vista Homeowners Association. She doesn't wave. She doesn't speak, she just watches, chin lifted, eyes fixed on my wife with that bright, hungry focus I've seen before, on people who think the universe is finally proving them right. She did this. Bethany is the one who started the letters about sightlines and neighborhood character the week after she learned we were using the barn for training. She's the one who complained about tactical equipment near her lake view. And I'd bet my last fence post she's the one who called the sheriff tonight with 3 little words that change everything. Screaming, weapons, disturbance. "Officer," Sarah says again, a shade firmer, "you have your weapon drawn on an unarmed homeowner who's following your instructions. I need you to be certain what you're responding to." "Ma'am, don't tell me how to do my job," he snaps. The gun doesn't waver. Behind her, the open barn is just a dark rectangle in the fading light. Inside, there are rubber mats, kettlebells, resistance bands, an old tractor, a few paper targets tacked to the far wall. Out here, with the strobes flashing and Bethany soaking it in like opening night, our whole life looks different. "Marcus, stay by the truck," Sarah says, still not looking at me. She uses the tone she saves for flash flood warnings and downed power lines. Not angry, not afraid, just firm enough that arguing would be stupid. I swallow down the dozen things I want to yell. The dust grits between my teeth. "This is our home," I say anyway, quieter. "We didn't do anything wrong." The younger officer by the fence shifts his stance. "Sir," he says, just loud enough for me to hear, "we got a call about yelling and possible weapons. We have to check it out." "In the barn?" I ask. "You think we're hiding hostages between hay bales and squat racks?" His ears go pink. He glances toward Bethany's SUV, then quickly back at the deputy with the drawn gun. A loose strand of Sarah's hair blows across her cheek. She doesn't move to brush it away. "Dispatch, Unit 3, the deputy mutters into his radio, never breaking eye contact. "Subject remains non-compliant. Possible tactical operation on site." Non-compliant. The word hits harder than the sirens. Sarah is doing everything he asked, short of lying down in the dirt. The only thing she isn't doing is shaking. Maybe that's what scares him. "Officer," she says, tone dropping half a step, "for everyone's safety, I'm going to restate this. I am unarmed. My hands are up. I am standing on my own property. There is no active threat here. You responded to a call that misrepresented the situation." A bead of sweat slides down from under his hat, tracks along his temple. The barrel of the pistol doesn't shake, but it doesn't lower either. The black line between them feels like a crack running straight through the middle of my life. Down by the lake, something splashes. The generator by the well kicks on with a low hum. The land itself feels like it's holding its breath. "This is insane," I whisper. Because it is. Because this all started with a letter about grass height and community standards, and now my wife is standing in a cone of headlights with a gun aimed at her head. Because somewhere between a bogus HOA safety complaint and these flashing lights on my dirt road, the truth got twisted into something unrecognizable. Yet she's staring down a barrel on the land we bled and sweated to call our own. As the lights strobe, the dust swirls, and Bethany Crowell watches like a queen on a hill. One thought pushes through the noise in my head, cold and sharp. How did a simple ranch complaint turn into this? To answer that, you have to see this place the way it was before the sirens. On most evenings, the only light on our ridge came from the setting sun and the porch bulbs I still hadn't gotten around to replacing. The gravel road wound up from the county highway like a gray scar, crossed the cattle guard with a hollow clang, and climbed past the weathered wooden gate that reads Hale Ranch in letters I burned myself. Beyond that, it was just us, the land, and the wind. The first time I drove up here alone, there were no police cars, no HOA presidents, just me and a dusty half-ton, a stack of closing papers on the passenger seat, and a knot in my chest I didn't know how to name. The clouds were hanging low over the snowy range, turning the peaks purple. The air smelled like sun-baked dirt and ponderosa pine. I stopped by the gate and pressed my hand flat against the post. 40 acres, I murmured. Ours. After 20 years with the Army Corps of Engineers building levees and dams on somebody else's orders, that word felt strange. Ours. This wasn't government land or a floodplain on a project map. This wasn't a motel room between job sites. This was ground I'd chosen, paid for, and signed my name to with a pen that shook more than I'd admit. The lake below the ridge is man-made, held in place by a dam I helped design back before I ever dreamed I'd be staring at its water from my own front porch. That's the irony that still makes me smile sometimes. I used to look at topo maps and hydrology models. Now I look at the same water and think about hay prices and whether the spring runoff will bring enough to fill the troughs. Back then, the only thing that flickered on that lake at night were the stars. "Marcus, you're doing that thing again," Sarah said once, months later. She was leaning in the doorway with a coffee mug, watching me stare out toward the dam instead of eating dinner. "Counting culverts in your head." I snorted. Force of habit. Her hand slid around my waist as she joined me on the porch. The railing was rough under my palms. I still hadn't gotten around to sanding it. Out past the fence line, our goats picked at sagebrush, bells tinkling softly. The barn loomed hardy and square against the sky, more silhouette than structure in the fading light. Down at the waterline, waves tapped lazily against rock. "It's peaceful," she said quietly. "That was the idea," I answered. When we first walked that barn together, it was nothing special. Just an old timber frame with a rusted roof, the smell of old hay and engine oil baked into every board. Dust motes floated in the sunbeams like lazy ghosts. The previous owner left an ancient tractor in one corner and a busted chest freezer in the other. Sarah ran her hand along one of the beams, then down the length of a stall gate. "You know what I see?" she asked. "Splinters?" I grunted. "A training space," she said. "Rubber flooring over cone. Here. Racks along that wall. Ropes from the rafters. Women from town who don't want to drive 45 minutes to work out in a strip mall." I studied her face. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about kettlebells and hill sprints. The way she kept moving, sketching in the air with her hands, as if the future was already there if she could just outline it clearly enough. "You really think folks out here want that?" I asked. She shrugged. "Out here, people need to be strong more than most. Lifting feed, shoveling snow, chasing kids. They deserve to feel capable. Besides," her mouth hitched into a half smile, "I have a hard time sitting still." So we did it. We scrubbed the barn, swept out nests, patched boards. I spent 2 weekends wiring extra outlets and running lights along the rafters. Sarah ordered mats and ropes and a set of cast iron bells heavy enough to make my old knees complain. Little by little, the smell of mold and oil gave way to rubber, chalk, and that metallic hint of hard-earned sweat. The first morning she opened the doors, the air still had a bite in it. Frost clung to the fence posts like white moss. 3 trucks and a minivan crunched up the drive, tires on gravel loud in the cold quiet. Women in hoodies and worn jeans climbed out, hugging themselves against the wind, eyeing the barn like it might bite. "Morning," Sarah greeted them, voice warm and sure. "Welcome to the ridge." They came back the next week, and the next. A nurse from town, a school bus driver, a ranch wife with a bad back who'd been told to just rest so many times she'd nearly forgotten what working hard felt like. Under those rafters, with the lake glinting through the open doors, they learned how to deadlift feed sack weight and lunge with confidence. They laughed a lot. Sometimes they cried. Out there, no one knew Sarah's old job title. They just knew she noticed when their shoulders were rounded or their stance was too narrow and corrected them kindly. They knew she could carry a 100-pound hay bale like it was a grocery bag. They knew she made everyone coffee after class and refused to let anyone talk badly about their own bodies. "You ever miss it?" I asked her one night, when the only sound was crickets and the distant rumble of a train along the valley. She didn't have to ask what I meant. "I miss some of the people," she said. "I don't miss the constant noise, or the feeling that your whole life can be turned upside down by one decision you made at midnight in a pool." I looked over, but her face was in shadow. The brim of her cap hid her expression, but I saw her thumb rub absently along the rim of her mug, the way it does when she's holding back more words. "You like it here?" I pressed. She let out a slow breath. I like waking up and knowing which way the wind is going to blow just by how the pines sound, she said. I like that the goats don't care what rank I used to be. I like watching you argue with that fence post over there because you cut it a quarter-inch short. I made a face. It was an eighth. She chuckled softly and bumped my shoulder with hers. Out in the dark, one of the goats bleated like it agreed. Life settled into a rhythm after that. Mornings, coffee, chores, Sarah's early class in the barn, with music thumping just loud enough to drift down the hill. Afternoons, my consulting work done from the kitchen table, red pens scratching over engineering plans emailed from states away. Evenings, fence checks, sunsets painting the lake copper, porch lights flicking on one by one across the water where the HOA houses sat in tidy little rows. They were a different world down there. From our ridge, Lakeshore Vista looked like someone had taken a magazine advertisement and pressed it up against the shoreline. Identical A-frame cabins, manicured lawns, decorative boulders trucked in from somewhere they've never camped. At night, their porch lights cast tidy circles on carefully sealed driveways. Little white signs with the HOA logo dotted their entrances. Private access. Community rules apply. For months, that line between us and them stayed invisible but firm. They stayed on their side of the lake. We stayed on ours. I waved at a couple fishing off the HOA dock once. They stared like I'd shouted in church. It didn't bother me. I'd spent a long time being the outsider, the guy passing through town in a government truck. I was used to being the stranger. It was enough that the land knew us, that the goats knew the sound of my boots in gravel, and the barn smelled like chalk and hard work, and the faint citrus of the cleaner Sarah insisted on buying. If you'd asked me then, I would have said we had everything we wanted. A roof we owned, a barn that echoed with laughter and the clank of iron, a lake I'd helped contain by poring over blueprints years before, now throwing reflected light against our windows. Nights quiet enough that you could hear coyotes singing 2 ridges over. No sirens, no strobing lights, no handguns drawn. And then one afternoon, that changed. We were in town picking up mineral blocks and chicken feed when I felt Sarah tense beside me in the hardware aisle. I followed her gaze toward the front windows of the lakeside co-op. A woman stood just outside the glass, bright blouse, sharp blazer, phone in hand. She wasn't looking at the lakefront brochures or the buckets of seed stacked on pallets. She was watching Sarah, eyes narrowed like she was trying to place a face she hadn't expected to see this far from the coast. She didn't wave then either, just studied my wife with the same too-focused stare I'd later see over the roof of a white SUV as a deputy drew his gun. Bethany Crowell, the woman who would turn our quiet ridge into a battleground paved with paperwork and bad faith. At the time, I just reached for another bag of feed and pretended not to notice. Sarah's jaw worked once, like she was biting down on something she didn't want to taste. Then she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Let's go," she said. "Storm's coming." I thought she meant the clouds rolling over the peaks. I was wrong. The storm blew in 3 days later, not from the sky, but from the county road, rolling up our gravel drive with the slow confidence of someone who believed the world ought to part for her. I was fixing the latch on the goat pen when I heard tires crunching over the cattle guard. The sound carried oddly in the morning air, crisp and bright, like the crack of a branch in hunting season. I glanced up, expecting a delivery truck, or maybe one of Sarah's students arriving early. Instead, a spotless white SUV crested the ridge. It eased to a full stop in front of our wooden gate, our leaning, sun-faded gate with my last name burned across the top. For a moment it idled there, engine humming, windows reflecting nothing but the cloudless sky. Then the driver's door opened. Out stepped the same woman from the co-op, bright blouse tucked under a sharper blazer, Hair styled perfectly despite the wind, lips pressed so tight they looked carved. She clutched a leather-bound clipboard like a judge about to read a verdict. Sarah was already walking back from the barn, wiping chalk from her hands onto her pants. Her expression softened when she saw me, then tightened again when her gaze slid to the SUV. Well, I thought, here we go. The woman didn't wait for an invitation. She strode right up to the gate, adjusted her sunglasses, and peered across our yard as though checking for contraband. "Good morning," she announced, each syllable crisp enough to cut wire. "I'm Bethany Crowell, president of the Lakeshore Vista Homeowners Association." I leaned my forearms on the fence rail, careful not to sigh. "We're not part of Lakeshore Vista." Bethany's smile didn't shift, but something behind it sharpened. "I'm aware," she replied, "but your property borders our community, and certain standards must be upheld for the benefit of everyone who enjoys this lake." She said it like the lake belonged to her personally, like the dam hadn't been built 20 years before her subdivision even existed, like my deed didn't explicitly describe water access as part of the parcel. Sarah came to stand beside me, her arms crossing gently, not defensive, just steady. "What kind of standards?" she asked lightly. Bethany flipped a page on her clipboard. "For starters, your grass height is inconsistent with community expectations." I looked at the ground. Dry prairie grass waved in the breeze, low near the gate, higher near the goat pen, because we hadn't finished clearing the spring growth. Pretty normal for Wyoming. "We're a working ranch," I said, "not a golf course." She ignored that. "And your goats," she continued, tapping her pen against the page, "are visible from the main road. Livestock should not obstruct scenic views for residents and visitors." Sarah stifled a laugh. "They're goats," she said. "They wander. That's kind of their whole thing." Bethany didn't crack a smile. "And that barn," she pointed toward the open doors, where kettlebells and ropes hung neatly from hooks. "What exactly is that being used for?" "Training," Sarah said simply. "For what purpose?" "For people." Bethany pressed her lips together. "It resembles a tactical facility." "It resembles a gym," I corrected. "A gym my wife built with her own hands." Bethany jotted something down with the brisk impatience of a school principal documenting a failing student. "I'll need to conduct a compliance inspection," she said. "You won't be conducting anything," I replied, firm but not rude. "This property is outside HOA jurisdiction, always has been." She stepped closer to the gate, lowering her sunglasses so I could see her eyes, pale, intense, searching. "Communities share boundaries," she said. "You might not be under our rules, but you do affect our environment. I expect cooperation." Sarah leaned forward just a little, voice soft. "And I expect respect," she said, "for our land and for our privacy." The breeze shifted. A sheet metal rattle echoed from the barn roof. Somewhere behind us, a goat bleated a complaint. Bethany didn't blink. She scribbled another note. "I'll be in touch," she said finally. Then she turned sharply, heels crunching on gravel, and climbed into her SUV. The door slammed with a muted thud, the kind that sounds heavier than it should. Moments later, she backed down the drive, tires spitting dust like exhaust from a steam engine. I exhaled slowly. "That woman walks like she's late to her own coronation," I muttered. Sarah didn't smile. "She's not just irritated," she said quietly. "She's searching." "For what?" Sarah's fingers tightened around the rag in her hand. "I don't know yet." The next morning, Bethany returned. No knock, no greeting, just a silent appearance beyond the fence, sunglasses glinting in the sun. She took photos of the goat pen, then of the barn, then of the lake access trail near the bottom of the property. 2 days later, she returned again, this time with a measuring tape. She knelt in the grass, checking height like a surveyor laying boundary lines. She paced along the fence with a small level, then photographed our pickup truck like it might be evidence in a trial. A week passed, and her visits grew more frequent. Early mornings, late afternoons, sometimes after dark when the porch light cast long shadows across the dirt. "She's building something," Sarah murmured one evening as we watched Bethany's SUV roll away for the 5th time that week. "Not a case, a narrative." "For what?" I asked. Sarah didn't answer, but I saw the storm gathering behind her eyes, the feeling that something we couldn't yet see was crawling toward us from across the lake. Something old, something personal, something with teeth. I should have trusted that instinct more than I did. It started small, too small to justify saying anything out loud. A car idling a little too long near the cattle guard. A shape standing on the HOA walking path across the waterline, unmoving, facing our ridge instead of the lake. The faint metallic glint of binoculars catching the sun before dipping out of sight. Little things, easy to brush off. Then the little things started happening every day. One morning, I opened the front door to grab the mail and nearly bumped into Bethany Crowell, standing just outside our fence, camera raised. She didn't greet me, didn't pretend to be photographing the scenery. She clicked a picture of the barn, lowered the camera, and wrote something on her clipboard without looking up. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked. "Documenting," she replied, voice cool as lake water. "Routine checks." "There's nothing routine about you being here at 7 in the morning," I said. Bethany didn't bother arguing. She just gave a dry, polite nod, the kind people reserve for customers they want to get rid of, and headed back to her white SUV. The tires spat gravel as she turned around and rattled off down the road. Dust hung in her wake long after she disappeared from view. I expected Sarah to be irritated when I told her. Instead, she went very still, the way she does when she's listening for something beneath the surface. "What angle was she shooting from?" she asked. "What?" "What angle? Where was she standing? What was she looking at more, the barn or the yard?" I frowned. "Does it matter?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked out toward the lake where the fog was beginning to lift, pulling wisps of silver off the water. "It matters," she murmured. The next day, Sarah's early class had half a dozen women moving through circuits inside the barn. Sled pushes, box step-ups, heavy carries. I was repairing the western fence when I noticed movement near the HOA trail across the lake. A figure was standing behind one of the decorative lodgepole pines the HOA planted last fall. Through the branches, I saw the glint again. Binoculars. The figure was staring straight at the barn doors. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and squinted, trying to confirm what I was seeing. Before I could, the binoculars dipped and the figure walked briskly back toward the HOA houses. "Sarah," I said later, "someone was watching the barn during class." She didn't look surprised. She didn't even look alarmed. She just nodded once, slowly. "Describe them." "Couldn't see clearly," I said, "but I think it was her." Bethany. The name hung between us like smoke. By the end of the week, there was no more ambiguity. Bethany wasn't hiding her surveillance anymore. She'd begun showing up almost anywhere Sarah was. When Sarah did her morning runs down the ridge trail, Bethany would be standing at the bottom, pretending to scroll through her phone while glancing up after each few steps. If Sarah carried feed buckets across the yard, Bethany would park just beyond the property line and watch from her SUV. Once, while Sarah tended to the small vegetable patch near the porch, I saw Bethany crouched beside a boulder across the road, snapping pictures through the sage like she was photographing a rare bird. That was the day I marched out to the gate. "Hey!" I called across the road. "Enough!" Bethany straightened up slowly, dusting off her knees. She didn't look ashamed or startled. She just tilted her head, regarding me with the cold politeness of a bureaucrat who has already filled out the paperwork for whatever comes next. "You should be careful how you speak to a community official," she said. "These inspections are for everyone's benefit." "You don't have jurisdiction here," I said. "You know it. We know it. The county knows it. So what exactly are you doing?" "Ensuring safety," she said calmly. "Safety from what?" Her eyes slid past me toward Sarah, who was kneeling beside the tomatoes, hands deep in soil. "That's what I'm still determining." I felt my stomach twist. The way she said it, flat, focused, sent a chill down my back. It wasn't a threat, exactly, but it wasn't not a threat. That night, after we locked up the barn and the goats settled, I found Sarah sitting on the porch steps, elbows resting on her knees. The porch light cast a soft halo around her, turning the dust swirling in the air into faint gold. "She's escalating," Sarah said quietly. "What do you think she wants?" Sarah didn't answer at first. The wind rustled through the pines, low and steady. A few coyotes yipped in the distance. "I've seen this pattern," she said finally. "Years ago in a different context. People watching movements, collecting images, studying patterns. It's not about property lines anymore. It's about me." My jaw tensed. "Why?" Again she hesitated, but just for a moment. "Because she recognizes something," Sarah said. "Something she shouldn't." "From where?" I pressed. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." A week later, we got our first real clue. We were at the feed store again, picking up mineral blocks for the goats. Two older women near the counter were deep in conversation. Voices low but urgent. Normally I wouldn't pay attention, but I heard a name that made my spine lock. Crowell. I froze. Sarah did too. "Down at City Hall every day this week," one of the women whispered. "Digging through old records, military stuff." "Still chasing that training accident story?" the other murmured. "That girl never recovered after being dismissed." I felt Sarah's hand close around my arm. "She's not just looking at us," she said under her breath. "She's looking back." "Back at what?" Sarah didn't answer, but the fear in her eyes wasn't for herself. It was for what Bethany might find. Driving home, the afternoon sun flashed off the lake, turning it white and bright. The dust from our tires billowed behind us, drifting across the road like smoke. "She's digging through old military files," I said softly. "Why would she do that?" Sarah stared out the window, jaw tight. "Because she's searching for a person," she said. "Someone from my past." "Who?" I asked. When she looked at me, the answer was already there in her eyes, heavy, inevitable. "Someone named Crowell," she said quietly. "Someone she lost." The truck rumbled up the ridge road, gravel ticking against the undercarriage like small, sharp reminders of every question I didn't want to ask. Sarah didn't say another word the entire drive home. She kept her gaze fixed on the lake, eyes distant, shoulders tight beneath her flannel. The silence between us wasn't angry. It was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. At the top of the ridge, the wind shifted. A gust ran through the pines, bending them just slightly, brushing a cold finger along the back of my neck. I killed the engine, and for a long minute we just sat there, staring at our porch, our barn, our land, the place that was supposed to be our clean slate. "Sarah," I said finally, "tell me what's going on." She didn't move. Then she inhaled slowly, like she was bracing for an old bruise to be touched. "There was a trainee," she began. "Years ago. Her name was Rachel Crowell." The name hit like a stone dropped into a still pond. Small impact, big ripples. "Rachel was young," Sarah continued. "Talented, determined to prove herself. But she She broke protocol during a night water drill. Serious protocol. I waited, letting her speak in her own time. She pushed past a safety marker, Sarah said. Went deeper into the course than she was cleared for. The current pulled her offline. Another trainee nearly drowned trying to reach her. My breath caught. Sarah. I had to file the report, she said simply. It was my responsibility. They removed her from the program. Her injury wasn't severe, but her future there was gone. She swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the barn, as though the open doors might swallow the memory whole. She blamed me, Sarah whispered. Or maybe her family did. Or both. I don't know. I didn't follow up. I couldn't. She disappeared from the pipeline, and I moved to another assignment. But Bethany didn't forget. I finished for her. Sarah nodded, slow and tired. You think she recognized you at the co-op? I asked. I think she saw a face she's hated for years, Sarah answered, and she decided this was her chance to even a score I didn't know she was keeping. The goats bleated from behind the barn, tugging me back to the present. The sun was sliding toward the horizon, glazing the lake in molten copper. Somewhere across the water, Bethany might have been standing on her perfect little porch, staring back at our ridge through those binoculars, piecing together fragments from a past she had twisted into her own story. So all this, I said, the photos, the measurements, the stalking, it's not HOA business. No, Sarah said, it's vengeance. The word settled heavy in the air. I followed her inside. Sarah walked straight to the kitchen drawer where we kept random odds and ends. Rubber bands, old receipts, mismatched batteries. She dug out a small envelope, yellowed around the edges, for a moment she hesitated, thumb brushing the flap. Then she handed it to me. Inside was a newspaper clipping. The headline read, Local woman injured in military training incident. Beneath it, a grainy photo of a young brunette. Determined eyes, squared shoulders. Rachel. She couldn't have been older than 22. The article was short, just a few paragraphs. It mentioned a night water drill, a safety breach, complications that ended her training. Then, near the bottom, Instructor S. Hale declined to comment on the incident. My eyes drifted to Sarah. Her arms were crossed, but her posture was rigid, like she'd been holding up some invisible weight for years. Why didn't you tell me any of this? I asked gently. Because it was behind me, she whispered. Because I didn't think it would follow me all the way to Wyoming. Because I never wanted this land, our land, to be touched by anything from that time. She walked to the window, staring out toward the barn, now dark against the evening glow. When I left that world, she continued, I promised myself I'd never bring its shadows into our home. But Bethany, she's pulling them out, one by one. I folded the clipping and set it on the counter. What do we do now? I asked. Sarah turned back toward me, and for the first time since this mess started, something steely flickered in her expression. It wasn't anger. It was resolve. We stay ahead of her, she said. We stay calm, and we don't let her version of the truth become the only one the authorities hear. Her voice had changed, subtly, but unmistakably. The softness was still there, but beneath it I could hear the trained precision of someone who had spent years making hard calls under pressure. Someone who knew how fast small misunderstandings could turn into catastrophic misjudgments. Someone who had carried responsibility for other people's lives. I stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. She can't rewrite what happened, I said. No, Sarah replied, but she can twist it until it breaks. The last light of day slipped behind the ridge, leaving long shadows stretching across the yard. The air cooled, and the barn lights flickered on one by one, casting warm squares across the dirt. Sarah's voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. She's not just angry about the past, Marcus. She's preparing something, building a story. And if I'm right? She looked at me, fear and certainty braided tightly in her eyes. She's not done. If I'd trusted her instincts fully, if I'd stopped trying to tell myself this was just an HOA nuisance, maybe I would have been ready for what came next. But trouble rarely knocks politely. It doesn't wait for permission. It comes the way Wyoming storms do, fast, sideways, and with a crack that splits the world in half. It started with the landline ringing. Not the cell phones, the landline. The old beige one mounted on the kitchen wall, the one we only kept because the previous owner insisted the ridge cell tower had moods. Calls on that phone were usually from the feed store, the vet, or telemarketers who didn't understand where Wyoming was. But that night, as dusk melted into the valley and the sky turned lavender behind the pines, the landline rang with a sharp, jarring shrill that sliced straight through the house. Sarah and I exchanged a look. She answered. "Hail, residents." A pause. Her posture changed instantly, shoulders straightening, breath going quiet after the first inhale. Not fear, not shock. Recognition. "Yes, sir," she said slowly. "I understand." I stepped closer. "What is it?" She held up one hand, not to silence me, but to concentrate. "No, sir," she said into the phone. "There has been no disturbance here. My husband and I are home. We've had a quiet evening." Another pause. A longer one. Her jaw tightened. "Of course," she said. "Yes. We'll remain available." She hung up without saying goodbye, which she almost never does. The old phone clicked back into place with a sound far too loud for the quiet kitchen. "Sarah," I said. "Talk to me." She leaned her hands against the counter, head bowed for a breath before she looked up. "That was the sheriff's department," she said quietly. "Someone made an anonymous call, claimed they heard screaming and weapons, and a possible domestic dispute." A coldness crept under my ribs. "That's a lie," I said. "We've been here all night." She nodded. "That's why they're sending deputies to check. 2 units. Outside, the evening wind rattled the metal rooster on the barn roof. The sky was turning that bruised shade between daylight and dark, when shapes blur and shadows stretch long fingers across the yard. "She's escalating," Sarah said. "This is the step people like Bethany take when they feel their story isn't strong enough on its own. They call in authority. They force someone else to carry out their narrative." "She's using the sheriff," I muttered, anger tightening my chest. "She's hoping law enforcement sees something they can misinterpret," Sarah corrected gently. "That's how cases get built without evidence. By emotion. By assumption." The goats bleated faintly from the pen. Their voices echoed strangely, bouncing off the barn doors like the land was already bracing for something. Headlights crested the ridge. 2 sets. White beams stretched long across the gravel, casting swinging shadows across the pasture fence. A dust plume followed behind them, rolling over the road like fog. "Marcus," Sarah said quietly, "whatever happens, let me speak first. Sarah, please." There was no command in her voice, no urgency, just a calm certainty that made me swallow the rest of my protest. She brushed her braid over her shoulder, wiped her palms on her jeans, and walked toward the front steps with the posture of someone going to meet a storm head-on. The first patrol truck rolled to a slow halt in front of our gate. The second parked slightly off-angle, tires crunching over loose rock. The engines idled low and heavy, vibrating the still air. 2 deputies stepped out. One older, stocky, with a mustache that curled slightly at the ends. The other younger, taut as a bowstring, hand hovering close to his holster, like muscle memory had outrun his judgment. The older one tipped his hat. "Evening, folks." "Evening," Sarah said evenly. "We understand there was a call?" "That's right," the older deputy replied. "Report of yelling, loud noises, possible disturbance involving firearms." "There were none," Sarah said plainly. The younger deputy scanned the yard, his eyes flicking from the porch to the barn, to the lake glinting behind us. His chest rose and fell too fast for the calm night. "We're going to need to check things out," he said. "Of course," Sarah agreed. "You're welcome to look anywhere outside. The barn doors are open if you'd like to walk through. We have nothing to hide." The older deputy nodded, appreciative of her cooperation. But the younger one seemed to tense even more, like her calm was wrong, as though confident people were suspicious by default. "Let's start with the barn," he said. We led them across the yard. The barn stood open, warm light spilling from inside onto the dirt. The air smelled faintly of chalk and cedar, with an undertone of livestock and sweat from the morning's class. Inside, kettlebells gleamed on the rack. Ropes dangled from overhead beams like thick vines. A sled sat by the far wall. Everything was organized. Clean. Ordinary if you knew what it was. Foreign if you didn't. The younger deputy's eyes widened. "What's all this?" he asked, stepping inside. "A training space for zone," Sarah said. "Strength and conditioning. For local women." "Looks tactical," he muttered. "It's fitness," she corrected. He wandered toward the corner rack where Sarah kept laminated workout plans and a few manuals she'd owned since her Navy days. Water survival, tactical conditioning, emergency response. Nothing classified. Nothing secret. Just professional training guides. But he didn't see them that way. He saw what he'd been primed to see. His hand drifted dangerously higher toward his holster. "Everything here is legal," Sarah said gently, "and all equipment is used strictly for exercise." The deputy didn't answer. He stepped closer to the shelf. His breathing hitched. His fingers twitched. "Deputy," Sarah said, her voice slowing the air itself. "I need you to take a breath. You're safe. We're all safe." That was when the radio on his chest crackled. A sharp burst of static. He flinched. His hand jerked. His weapon came out in one smooth, terrifying motion. And suddenly, the barrel was pointed straight at Sarah. "Back up!" he barked. "Hands where I can see them!" The barn fell silent except for the buzz of the overhead lights. The world shrank to the faint tremble of his gun, the dust swirling in the beam of a single fluorescent bulb, and the steady rise and fall of Sarah's breathing. Her hands lifted slowly. "I'm complying," she said softly. "You're scared. I can see that. But I'm not a threat." His grip tightened. "Marcus," she said without turning her head. "Don't move." I froze. The older deputy stepped forward, alarm widening his eyes. "Daniels, holster your weapon." But the younger one didn't hear him, or didn't believe him. His breath was ragged, shoulders rigid. "Please," Sarah whispered, "focus on my hands, nothing else." The overhead lights flickered. The lake wind rattled the barn siding, and everything in my life, the land, the barn, the peace we built, balanced on the trembling aim of one frightened man responding to one malicious lie. Deputy Daniels's hands shook so hard, the small beam of his weapon-mounted light danced across Sarah's chest like a frantic firefly. His breath came fast and uneven, fogging the air in brief white bursts. The barn smelled of cedar dust, sweat, and the faint rubber scent of the training mats. But suddenly all of it was swallowed by the sharp chemical tang of fear. "Don't move," he barked. "I'm standing still," Sarah replied, calm enough to sound unreal in that moment. My hands are up. My feet are planted. You're in control. He wasn't. Anyone could see that. The problem was that he didn't know it. The older deputy, Reynolds, held out an open hand toward Daniels as though approaching a spooked horse. "Daniels, son, ease up," he said. "She's cooperating. No threat here." But Daniels didn't lower the gun. His eyes were locked on Sarah, wide and glassy, pupils blown so large the whites seemed swallowed up. He wasn't seeing her. He was seeing whatever story Bethany had whispered into his imagination. Weapons, tactical training, dangerous individuals. A lie spoken with confidence can sometimes overpower the truth spoken plainly. Sarah took a slow breath. "Deputy Daniels," she said, voice steady as bedrock, "you're operating under adrenaline. That's normal, but it means you're processing information differently. I want you to listen to the facts." "Stop talking," he snapped, voice cracking on the last syllable. She didn't flinch. "I'm unarmed," she continued. "You can see both my hands. Nothing in this barn is illegal. You're pointing your weapon at a civilian who has not made a single aggressive move." Reynolds tried again. "Holster the gun, Daniels. That's a direct—" "Don't come closer," Daniels shouted, stumbling a half-step back, the gun bobbing dangerously with the motion. The barn lights hummed overhead, then flickered once. Just once. But enough to make Daniels jerk sideways, weapon tilting offline before snapping right back to Sarah. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it made my vision blur. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to step between them, grab his arm, do something. But I knew, deep down in the same place every soldier keeps the memory of the worst night they ever lived through, that any sudden movement would get her killed. "Sarah," I choked. Her eyes flicked toward me for half a heartbeat. Soft, steady, reassuring. Then she returned her gaze to Daniels with clinical focus. "Deputy," she said, "you're in a heightened state. I understand. So let's slow everything down. Right now, your weapon is drawn without a confirmed threat. That means you're operating outside protocol." "Shut up!" he yelled, voice raw. "You need to identify the threat you believe you're responding to," she said. "Say it out loud. What do you think is happening right now?" The question hit him like a slap. He blinked, confused, for the first time since drawing the gun. I got a call," he stammered. "A disturbance. Yelling. Weapons. Tactical training. Possible danger." "There's no yelling," Sarah said gently. "There are no weapons in my hands. You haven't seen one anywhere on my person. The equipment behind me is fitness equipment. Nothing here is illegal. Nothing here is threatening you." Daniels swallowed hard. His shoulders twitched. The barrel wavered. Just a hair, but it wavered. Reynolds took another cautious step. "You're safe, son. Lower the gun." Daniel's breaths came in short, sharp bursts now, fogging the space between him and Sarah. "I said," he began. "Deputy," Sarah cut in. "Look at my hands." He did. Steadily, slowly, she rotated them, palms out, fingers spread wide under the harsh light. Smooth motions, controlled, deliberate. She was walking him backward through fear, the way a seasoned instructor walks a rookie through their first night dive. "Both hands. No weapon," she said. "Move your eyes, not your aim. Keep your focus on what's real, not what you were told." Daniels's lower lip trembled. Across the barn, the lake wind pushed through a knothole in the siding, making a soft, hollow whistle. The dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight like drifting snow. He looked terrified, not just nervous. Terrified. "Sir," he said in a thin voice, still staring at Sarah. I don't understand what's happening." "I do," she replied softly. You were given information that made you afraid. But fear doesn't mean danger is real. You need to reassess. Right now. Reynolds stepped forward again, determined, but still cautious. Daniels, he said firmly, lower your weapon. Another small tremble. Daniels's arms dropped a fraction of an inch. Just a fraction. But I saw it. So did Sarah. That's good, she said, voice warmer now. You're doing just fine. Keep breathing. Another inch. Then another. Finally, after what felt like hours but must have been seconds, Daniels lowered the muzzle fully. His shoulders sagged. His knees wobbled. The gun hung loose in his grip, as though he'd suddenly remembered how heavy it really was. Reynolds moved quickly, placing a steady hand on the young deputy's forearm. Holster it! Daniels obeyed, fumbling slightly but getting it secured. His chest heaved as the adrenaline drained out of him all at once. Sarah slowly lowered her hands. The barn seemed to exhale with her. Reynolds turned to us, shame and apology etched deep into the lines of his face. I'm sorry, he said quietly. This shouldn't have happened. Agreed, Sarah replied, but I understand how it did. Daniels leaned against the barn wall, rubbing both hands over his face, breathing like he'd just run a marathon. You knew what to say, he whispered to Sarah without looking up. You handled that, like you've been there before. She didn't answer, but I saw the faintest flicker in her eyes, the one that always shows up when the past pulls a chair up to the table uninvited. Reynolds cleared his throat. We'll file a report, a full one, and we'll look into whoever made that call. Sarah nodded. Do that. As they walked back to their trucks, I watched Daniels glance once more toward the barn, toward the equipment he'd mistaken for something dangerous, and then toward Sarah. He looked like a man who'd realized, too late, how close he'd come to ruining everything. When their taillights finally disappeared over the ridge, the ranch fell silent again. No sirens, no shouts. Just the soft whistle of the wind through the barn siding and the steady beat of my heart, slowing back to something like normal. Sarah leaned against the doorframe, letting out a long breath. Marcus, she said quietly, this wasn't a mistake. And I knew she was right. Someone had engineered tonight with precision. Someone had set the dominoes. Someone wanted this. But the worst part? They had no idea who they were provoking. After the deputies pulled away and the dust settled back into the ruts of our drive, the ranch went still, unnaturally still. The kind of quiet that presses into your ears, waiting to see what you'll do next. The goats had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I stood just outside the barn, palms damp, heartbeat still uneven, trying to make sense of what had almost happened. Sarah walked past me without a word. Not hurried, not shaken. Just purposeful, controlled, like a switch had flipped. She stepped into the kitchen, turned on the overhead light, and pulled out the drawer where we kept a jumble of receipts, spare keys, dried-out pens, and mismatched batteries. She dumped the whole thing onto the table, sifted through it, and pulled out a thin black notebook I hadn't seen her touch in years. What's that? I asked. My logbook, she said, flipping it open to a clean page. I need to document everything before the details fade. Her voice was level, but something had changed in it, a precision I hadn't heard in years. She sat down at the table, pen in hand, posture straight, as if she were back in a briefing room on some base hundreds of miles from our quiet ridge. I watched her write. Time, date, names, sequence of commands, weapon draw, officer fear indicators, environmental interference. She wasn't journaling. She was building evidence. You okay? I finally asked. Fine, she said. Now talk me through what you saw. Every word, every movement. Sarah, I don't think… Marcus. She looked up. Her eyes were sharp, focused. If we don't get this right, Bethany will get away with it. I sat across from her as she transcribed every detail I could recall. The radio crackling, Daniels's grip tightening, Reynolds trying to intervene, the tremble in the deputy's arms, the flicker of the lights. She wrote in quick, neat strokes, like each line had a place and she already knew it. Her handwriting hadn't changed since the first time I saw it on a sticky note she left on my lunch years ago. Clean, efficient, no wasted loops. When we finished, she pulled a small camera from the top cabinet and headed outside. I followed her into the cool night air. What are you doing now? I asked. Recording the scene, she said. Lighting, distance, angles, his position relative to the equipment. Under the porch lamp, she crouched in the dirt and took photos of footprints, tire marks, even the slight depression near the barn where Daniels had braced his heel while aiming the gun. She photographed the shelf where he'd fixated on her manuals. She filmed a slow pan of the barn interior and the training gear, narrating calmly, "No weapons present. Civilian sporting equipment only." Her voice was steady, professional. She wasn't just documenting. She was preparing a case. I leaned against the barn doorframe, arms crossed, unsure where to jump in. "You've done this before?" She paused mid-recording and looked at me over the camera. "Yes," she said. "I've done this before." "Why?" I asked. "Why do you know all this? How?" She lowered the camera slowly. For a moment, she didn't speak. The barn light framed her face in warm gold, deepening the shadows beneath her eyes. She wasn't afraid of what had happened, but she knew exactly how close it had come to ending differently. "When I was in Naval Special Operations," she said quietly, "documentation was survival. If something went wrong in training, you needed proof of what happened. If you made a call, you had to justify it. Chain of command doesn't accept gut feelings. They accept evidence." She turned the camera off. The barn fell silent again. "Is that why they called you Ghost?" I asked. She let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but humorless. "No," she said. "They called me Ghost because problems never stuck to me. I made them disappear. Cleanly, quietly, thoroughly." Her eyes met mine, calm, steady, unwavering. "You want to know what I learned in that job?" she continued. "That truth loses if you don't protect it, if you don't build it stronger than the lie. That's what I'm doing now. Protecting the truth so Bethany can't twist it into something else." She walked past me, heading toward the porch with determined strides. I followed, heat rising under my collar, not from anger at Sarah, but anger for her. "I can't believe she did this," I muttered. "Calling the sheriff like that. Putting you in danger." "Oh, Marcus," she said softly. "She's not done putting us in danger." Inside, Sarah went straight to the dining room and cleared the table with fast, efficient motions. She set her notebook down in the center, then grabbed maps of the property from the cabinet drawer. She taped them to the table. Then she added printouts of county boundaries. Then she pulled out a legal pad and began outlining sections. "Sarah," I said slowly, "what are you doing?" "Preparing," she said. "For what?" "For her next move." She paced once around the room, humming softly, thinking aloud in that careful, analytical tone I recognized from stories she never fully finished telling. "She's escalating because she thinks she's close to something. She's digging into my past. She's already weaponized the sheriff. She won't stop. She thinks this is personal justice." "It is personal," I said. "Not in the way she believes," Sarah replied. "She thinks she's dealing with an old instructor whose decision ruined her sister's career." Then she stopped pacing and looked me dead in the eyes. She has no idea she's dealing with someone who spent 8 years training people how to survive traps exactly like this. Her fingers tapped lightly on the table. Bethany thinks she's cornering me, she continued. But all she's doing is giving me the pattern of her behavior. And patterns can be predicted. I stepped closer. Meaning? Sarah pulled a fresh page from her notebook and wrote at the top, Phase 2, Legal Manipulation. She's already used rumor, then surveillance, then law enforcement. Next, she'll use legal paperwork, complaints, citations, restraining orders, things that plant doubt in official records. My stomach tightened. Can she do that? She'll try, Sarah said, especially after tonight. She set the pen down. Then she reached for my hands. Warm, steady hands that didn't tremble even after a gun had been pointed at her hours earlier. I'm not scared, Marcus, she said gently. So don't you be scared either. I'm not scared for me, I whispered. Her thumb brushed my knuckles. I know. The house creaked softly around us. The night outside was a cool blanket. The lake's surface gleamed silver under the rising moon. And inside the dining room, our dining room, Sarah Hale stood framed by the glow of the overhead light. Not as a fitness trainer, not as a ranch wife, but as the calm, calculating, extraordinary woman she truly was. Ghost. And now, she said, releasing my hands and picking up her pen again, it's my turn. The next 72 hours on the ridge felt different, charged, like the air right before lightning touches ground. Dawn still came soft over the lake. The goats still cried for their grain, and the pines still whispered along the slopes. But inside our house, something had changed. Sarah no longer moved like she was living on a quiet ranch. She moved like she was running an operation. At breakfast, she spread documents across the table. Maps, screenshots, printouts of county regulations, timestamps from our security cameras. At noon, she conducted interviews with neighbors who'd seen Bethany parked by our fence. At dusk, she cataloged audio recordings of calls, photos of footprints, and every documented inconsistency in Bethany's harassment pattern. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't emotional. It was surgical. By the third night, the dining room looked like a command center. Papers neatly organized, a line of color-coded tabs marking each escalation. Surveillance, false claims, misuse of HOA authority, weaponizing law enforcement. Sarah stood over the table in the warm lamplight, reading every line out loud, checking for gaps the way a carpenter checks for warping in a board. When she finished the last page, she clicked her pen. That's everything, she said. Now it needs to be delivered. Delivered to who? I asked. Her eyes flicked up, steady as a scope's crosshairs. Everyone. The next morning, before the sky even turned orange, Sarah printed 3 thick packets, dozens of pages each. She slid them into sturdy envelopes, sealed them, and labeled them with precise handwriting. Sheriff's Office State Attorney HOA Board, full review. She placed them side by side like pieces of a puzzle finally locked into place. Then she handed one to me. You'll take this to the sheriff, she said. I'll take the rest. You sure you don't want me with you? She smiled gently. No, this part needs to come from me. By 8 a.m., the sheriff's department had Sarah's full report. By 9, the state attorney had theirs. By noon, the HOA board, who had no idea their president had been waging a private war, received a packet that made 2 board members go pale and one ask if they needed legal counsel. And at exactly 12:17 p.m., Bethany made her final mistake. She filed an emergency restraining order against us, claiming that Sarah, a woman who had defused a gun instead of fighting, was dangerous, erratic, and involved in unauthorized paramilitary training. A hearing was scheduled for that same afternoon. You ready for this? I asked as we walked toward the courthouse steps. Sarah adjusted the papers tucked beneath her arm. as ready as I've ever been for anything. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, more like a town meeting hall than the marble chambers you see in films. A judge in a dark robe sat behind the bench, flipping through initial paperwork with practiced neutrality. Bethany sat to the right, wearing pearls and a powder blue blazer, her hair curled fresh, her expression the picture of offended dignity. She didn't look at us. Not once. When the judge called the case, Bethany stood first. "Your Honor," she said with the confidence of someone accustomed to having the floor, "my community has been terrorized. Mrs. Hale has created a tactical training site with unknown intentions and has displayed aggression, hostility, and threatening behavior for months." Sarah didn't move. "She has endangered residents," Bethany continued, "and last night, law enforcement was forced to intervene." The judge looked up. Forced to intervene with what? Bethany paused, searching for footing. With a dangerous escalation. Officers had to draw weapons due to her non-compliance. "Do you have evidence of that?" the judge asked. Bethany held up her phone triumphantly. "A police report is pending, Your Honor, but—" "Do you have evidence?" the judge repeated. "In your possession right now?" Bethany faltered. No, but the situation speaks for itself." "Mrs. Hale," the judge said, turning to Sarah, "your response?" Sarah stood, and the room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but I swear something in the air straightened its posture with her. "Your Honor," she began, "I would like to present the timeline of events leading to this moment." Her voice was calm, firm, and precise. She handed the judge a binder, the same one she had assembled in our dining room, and waited. The judge flipped the cover open. Inside was a perfectly organized chronology. Day 1, Bethany's first unauthorized inspection. Day 3, photos taken from public road, day 5 to 10. Surveillance from HOA property, day 14. City Hall record requests, day 17. False claims filed. Day 18. Weapon drawn on compliant civilian. Day 19. Emergency restraining order filed. Each event had photos, timestamps, and supporting evidence. "This," Sarah said, "is the pattern of harassment I've documented since Bethany Crowell recognized me at the co-op. She has targeted me with escalating behavior traced to a personal grievance from years ago." The judge scanned a page. "And what grievance is that?" Sarah paused, only for a moment. "Her sister, Rachel Crowell," she said. "She was dismissed from a special operations training program for safety violations. I was her instructor. I reported the violation. It ended her candidacy. It was not personal. It was protocol." A ripple moved across the courtroom. Bethany stiffened, lips tightening. "And you believe this history motivated Mrs. Crowell's actions?" the judge asked. "I don't have to believe it," Sarah said quietly. "I can play it." She pulled out a small audio recorder and pressed a button. Bethany's voice filled the room, unmistakable. "I found her, the woman who destroyed Rachel's career. Now it's my turn to destroy her life." The judge's pen froze. Bethany went sheet white. The courtroom fell so silent I could hear the old ceiling fan clicking above us. Sarah spoke again, steady as a metronome. "Your Honor, the Sheriff's Department responded last night to a false report. Deputy Daniels drew his weapon without cause. I have filed a formal complaint with full documentation. Everything I have provided today supports a restraining order, not against me, but against the person who orchestrated this harassment." The judge closed the binder, set it down gently, and looked at Bethany. "Mrs. Crowell," he said, voice sharp as a snapped branch, "do you have anything to say in response to any of this?" Bethany opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "Then," the judge continued, "the court denies your request. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented, the court issues a restraining order against you, effective immediately." She gasped. The judge wasn't finished. This matter will also be forwarded to the sheriff's internal review and the state attorney's office for investigation. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck wood. Everything in the room jumped. Bethany's face collapsed into a mask of disbelief. As Sarah gathered her papers, Bethany whispered, barely audible but unmistakably shaken, "You don't understand. You weren't supposed to win." Sarah paused, looked her in the eye. "No," she said softly. "You just didn't understand who you picked to fight with." When we stepped out of the courthouse, the afternoon sun was bright enough to make the asphalt shimmer. A warm wind blew down from the hills, carrying the scent of pine resin and dry summer grass. The courthouse steps felt solid under my boots, more solid than they had when we walked in. Behind us, the heavy wooden door clicked shut with a finality that made something ease inside my chest. "You did it," I murmured. Sarah didn't smile. Not yet. The relief hadn't fully reached her eyes. Justice, even when it's swift, takes time to settle. "Not me," she said. "The truth did." We drove home along the lakeshore highway in a quiet that wasn't heavy this time, just thoughtful, steady. The water glinted silver blue between the pines, sunlight breaking across its surface in sharp flashes like someone scattering handfuls of coins into the wind. A hawk glided overhead, riding a thermal higher and higher, wings barely moving. When we turned onto our ridge road, the dust lifted behind the tires in golden plumes. The goats were grazing near the fence, as if nothing monumental had happened today. The barn stood patiently on the hill, its doors open, sun pooling across the mats in long yellow stripes. Home. Sarah got out of the truck and paused beside the wooden gate. The sign I'd carved, Hale Ranch, was glowing warm in the lowering sun. "She really thought she could take this from us," she said quietly. "No," I corrected gently. "She thought she could take something from you. The land was just the excuse." Sarah nodded, running her fingers once across the grain of the post. Then she walked toward the porch, her steps sure and steady, the evening breeze stirring the loose strands of her hair. The next morning, everything changed again, not because of another attack, but because of the consequences. At 8 a.m., a county truck pulled up the ridge. Deputy Reynolds stepped out, hat in hand, uniform pressed. He wasn't smiling, but his expression held something close to respect. "Mrs. Hale," he said, when Sarah came out to meet him. "Internal Review asked me to inform you personally. Deputy Daniels has been placed on administrative leave pending full evaluation." I felt something inside me settle. Not satisfaction, just rightness. Reynolds continued, "The sheriff apologizes for what happened, and he's implementing mandatory retraining for all deputies on de-escalation and false call recognition." Sarah nodded. "Thank you for telling us." Reynolds cleared his throat, hesitating. "Between you and me, I read your report. It was cleaner than anything we get from half our department." He gave her a small nod. "Take care of yourselves." When he drove away, Sarah watched the dust trail fade, her arms folded lightly. The morning sun lit the lake in soft ripples as a breeze skimmed across it. Later that afternoon, a different vehicle appeared, a dark sedan with city plates. A woman in a navy suit stepped out, sharp-eyed, calm, carrying a folder tucked under her arm. "State Attorney's Office," she introduced herself. "We received your packet." Her voice had the clipped tone of someone used to dealing with fires, real ones, political ones, ones that eat careers alive. "We're opening a harassment and false report investigation into Mrs. Crowell," she said, "and we'll keep you updated." Then she added, voice lowering just slightly, "Your documentation was exceptional, and your recording? That was decisive." Sarah thanked her, and the woman drove off, leaving the ridge quiet again. But this was a different quiet. Not the quiet before a storm. The quiet after one. Word must have traveled faster than wildfire in August, because by evening the HOA board president, an older man named Martin with kind eyes and a handshake that felt like old rope, came up our drive in his dusty Subaru. "I had no idea what she was doing," he said immediately, before his tires even settled. "None of us did." He looked genuinely rattled. "She's been removed from her position," he added. "Effective immediately. And if you ever want to come down to the community events, you're welcome. We owe you better than what happened." Sarah shook his hand. "Thank you," she said simply. When he left, the ridge went still again. Only this time it felt like the land was exhaling, releasing a breath it had held for too long. 6 months passed. Summer bled into fall, the lake turning darker and colder, the edges frosting some mornings. The pines grew heavy with the scent of sap and rain. The goats thickened into their winter coats, and slowly, steadily, life filled back in over the scar Bethany had carved. One crisp October morning, I walked down to the barn with 2 mugs of coffee. The sun was rising behind the ridge, spilling pale gold through the open barn doors. Inside, 6 women were moving through Sarah's class, medicine balls slamming softly, ropes whipping in clean arcs, laughter echoing off the rafters. A young mom was doing farmer's carries past the mats, her face red but proud. A retired nurse grinned through a plank. Sarah walked between them, correcting form, calling out encouragement, her voice warm and sure. She didn't hide her background anymore, not the parts that mattered. She didn't advertise it either. She just lived openly, calmly, strongly, the way she was always built to live. After class, a few of the women stuck around, settling onto the porch steps with cold water bottles, chatting as the breeze skimmed across the lake. "Sarah," one of them said, "you ever think about teaching a self-defense workshop?" Sarah glanced over at me. "Maybe," she said, "if folks want it." Judging by the nods and eager smiles, they did. Later that day, as the barn cooled in the shadow of the ridge, I stood with Sarah at the waterline. The lake was quiet, broken only by the soft tapping of waves against the stones. The mountains rose behind it, like old guardians. "You ever think about how close we came to losing all this?" I asked. She reached down, picked up a smooth pebble, and tossed it into the water. The ripples spread outward in slow circles, merging with the lake's natural rhythm. "We never would have lost it," she said. "Bethany only had fear. We had facts." "And proof," I added. "And the truth," she said softly. The sun glinted off the water, shimmering like a promise finally kept. "You know," I murmured, sliding an arm around her waist, "sometimes justice really does arrive quietly." "Like water finding its level," she finished. We stood there as the ripples settled, the lake smoothing back to glass, the world gently righting itself. And for the first time in months, I felt peace. Not the fragile kind, the earned kind. If this story hit close to home, drop a simple justice in the comments. It's always good to know who'd stand their ground when it matters. Out here, dignity and the right to live in peace are worth fighting for, no matter what paperwork someone throws at you. And if you'd like more true HOA battles, ranch justice, and stories about good people protecting what's theirs, feel free to stick around and subscribe. I'd be glad to have you back on the ridge for the next one.